Welcome, students, to the first of maybe a series of paternity leave Matt's family economics videos. Hopefully this is helpful. If it's not, my suggestion to you is to go to ACDC Economics YouTube channel. Mr. Clifford does like super fast 60 seconds to like 4-minute long videos on all of these topics, but I'm the one testing you and teaching you, and so I'm going to try and explain it in a way that makes sense to me, and then you can ask me questions later. Speaking of, if Maddie, I think she goes by Maddie and not Miss Short, if she shows you any of these videos and you have questions, ask her to have me make follow-up videos that answer your questions for you. So here we go. I'm going to teach to you today absolute advantage, comparative advantage, terms of trade. I'm going to stop when my wife, the audience, and my baby daughter, Adelaide, say they understand what I'm teaching you. So here we go. Absolute advantage, comparative advantage, terms of trade talks about two countries. This is theoretical economics. It's two products, two countries, who can produce the most, should they trade, and if they do, what should the price be? Okay, so absolute advantage means if one country uses all of its resources to make one product, and so does another country, who could produce more? The answer is the country that has the absolute advantage. Comparative advantage is totally the opposite. It is the idea of what is the cost of producing one thing in terms of another one. And whoever can make one product more efficiently has a comparative advantage. This will make a lot more sense when we do an example. So, Claudia, can you pick one country?
El Salvador.
El Salvador. And Declan, pick another country.
Colombia.
Colombia. All right, Angelina, pick a product that both El Salvador and Colombia might be able to make.
Coffee.
Coffee. And Alex, another product that both of these countries could make.
Like clothes, like t-shirts.
Okay. All right, now, if El Salvador produces nothing but coffee in 1 year, they will be able to produce 20 tons of coffee.
Whoa.
If Colombia produces nothing but coffee in a given year, they will be able to produce, they're a much larger country, 30 tons of coffee. Now, if El Salvador, instead of producing any coffee, put all of its effort into making clothes, they could do 15, well, not a ton of clothes, but $15 billion worth of clothes. In Colombia, again, a larger country, larger population, if they made nothing but clothes, they would be able to produce more. They'd be able to produce $20 billion worth of clothes. Okay, Bjorn, if you look at El Salvador and Colombia, and forget about clothes, look at coffee, which country has an absolute advantage, straight up better at producing coffee? Is it El Salvador or is it Colombia?
Colombia.
And why do you say that?
Because they produce 30 tons instead of El Salvador's 20 tons.
Okay, so in terms of absolute advantage, you're right. Colombia has an absolute advantage in coffee. Okay, clothes. Both countries produce clothes, no coffee. El Salvador, Colombia, who has an absolute advantage in producing clothes?
Colombia again. They produce $20 billion worth.
Okay, instead of 15. So in terms of absolute advantage, Colombia is better at both products. The United States is kind of like this too. They make a lot of products better than most countries in the world. So, given this information, do you think Colombia and El Salvador should trade?
Well, if they make it cheaper, wouldn't it cost El Salvador more to trade with Colombia?
There's a lot of people that would say, well, given the fact that Colombia is better at both, they don't have any business trading, they probably are better off producing one product. Now, if we look at comparative advantage instead of absolute advantage, we'll end up seeing that one country is more efficient at one product, and the other is more efficient at the other product. So the way that we determine, I'm going to draw this up here so we don't forget our numbers. El Salvador, Colombia, coffee, clothes, 20, 30, 15, and 20. There is no formula required to understand absolute advantage. You just look at the numbers, totals, pick the higher number. That's the country with an absolute advantage. But for comparative advantage, you need to do a pretty simple formula. I've got a little mnemonic device that will help you remember it. Comparative advantage, we'll call it CA, is equal to the cost of the other product over the cost of what you produce. Okay. And the mnemonic device is other product over. Right? So when you're trying to remember to do the math, the other product, the thing you're not making, goes over what you do produce. Okay. Now, that's complicated until you see an example. So, let's see, who have we got here? ISIS. Pick El Salvador and pick Colombia. Which one? Pick a country.
Colombia.
Okay, Colombia. And pick clothes or coffee?
Close.
Okay. So we're going to look at the the cost of producing clothes for Colombia. Okay?
Okay.
So, the cost is equal to, if Colombia produces all clothing, what are they not able to make?
Coffee.
Okay? And if they were making coffee, how much would they be able to make?
30, was it tons?
Right, it's 30 tons. Okay, so they are not going to be making 30 tons of coffee because instead they're making all
$20 billion and
the cost of clothes. You're right. So, all right. And, Gracia, what's 30 divided by 20? You're right. Yeah, it's 1.5. That's 3 over 2. 3 over 2 is 1.5. So, in fact, the cost of making $1 billion worth of clothes, the cost of clothes, is equal to 1.5 tons of coffee. Okay. So again, for Colombia, this has nothing to do with El Salvador. The cost of making clothes, $1 billion worth of clothes, they have to give up 1.5 tons of coffee. Okay. I'm going to erase this formula. Okay. Again, this is Colombia. Cost of clothes, all right, the cost of coffee. All right, again, if we are making coffee, what can't we make any of?
close.
Can't make any clothes. So we are going to give up $20 billion worth of clothes. That is what we're not going to be able to make up, 20 billion, in order to make
30 tons of
30
coffee.
tons of coffee. All right. And Daniel, what's 20 divided by 30? Again, you're right. That is 0.67. Okay, so the cost of producing 1 ton of coffee, 1 ton of coffee is equal to a cost of $0.67 billion of clothes.
So is the cost, so like 1 ton of coffee, it's always whatever's on top, that like $20 billion worth of clothes is what it's equal to?
You're right. So
in terms of
that's
the
where
label?
The other over goes. The cost of coffee means that we put coffee on the bottom, and the other over is clothing over coffee. And again, cost of clothes, so we have clothes on the bottom. The other product, coffee, goes on the top, other over. Okay, so this is the cost. It's basically the opportunity cost for Colombia of producing clothes, which means they have to give up coffee, 1.5 tons of coffee, or the cost of coffee, 1 ton of coffee is worth $0.67 billion worth of clothes. This is just for Colombia. Now, this doesn't mean anything until we compare it to El Salvador.
So it doesn't matter. Oh, so it has to be compared to another country. It doesn't matter like how much money they would lose.
No.
Okay.
We have to compare it, and that's why they call it comparative advantage. So it's comparing one country's cost to another country's cost. Okay. Now, I've got a pretty small board here. I'm not quite used to it. We'll get better at this, but we'll do El Salvador on the bottom here. So we've got the cost of clothes on the top. So this is for El Salvador. Cost of clothes. All right. Win. For El Salvador, we make clothes. We give up 20 tons of coffee. So that's 20 over what we do produce.
Which is 15 tons
15.
of clothes.
Okay. 20 over 15. That is 1.3. So the cost of clothes, $1 billion worth of clothes. 1 billion clothes. We give up 1.3 tons of coffee. Now, let's do our first comparison. Cost of clothes. 1 billion clothes costs El Salvador 1.3 tons of coffee. For Colombia, it costs 1.5 tons of coffee. When both countries make clothes, which one gives up less coffee? I'll say it again. So El Salvador makes clothes, Colombia makes clothes. Both of them make $1 billion worth of clothes.
Oh,
right
so
here
both.
and right here, and this is what they give up. So this is their cost.
So
their
the one.
opportunity cost of making clothes. How much coffee did they give up?
So El Salvador gives up 1.3 billion tons of coffee.
Yep.
Okay, so the second C is coffee.
Yep. This is coffee.
So there are two C's.
You chose the products, but I'm the one that chose the small whiteboard, blackboard, so equally culpable. Okay, again, so this is actually the lower cost.
Mm-hmm.
They only give up 1.3 tons of coffee. Colombia gives up more. In fact, El Salvador, despite the fact that they make less, they give up less every time they make clothes than Colombia does. El Salvador has a comparative advantage in
For
producing clothes over Colombia.
Because they give up less coffee.
Okay. Now, El Salvador, the cost of coffee. Okay. Every time El Salvador makes coffee, they give up
15 tons of clothes.
Tons of clothes in order to produce $20
billion of coffee.
Let's see, it's not tons, it's
Oh, did it 20 billion and the other is
billion.
tons? Sorry.
That's all right.
Coffee is tons.
There we go. All right, 15 divided by 20 is 0.75. All right. Which is to say, when El Salvador makes coffee, 1 ton of coffee costs them $0.75 billion worth of clothes.
Okay, because clothes is on top in the equation, and so that is the cost.
Cost of coffee, clothes, cost of coffee. Okay, so El Salvador makes coffee. They get 1. They give up $0.75 billion worth of clothes. When Colombia produces coffee, also 1, they give up $0.67 billion worth of clothes. Which country has a larger cost of making coffee?
El Salvador.
Yeah, they give up $0.75 billion worth of clothes versus Colombia. So
clothes.
which one has a comparative advantage in producing coffee?
Colombia.
Okay, so if we're to look at this in terms of international trade, countries should actually produce what they can do most efficiently and then trade with the other country. So Colombia has comparative advantage in
Coffee.
Okay.
And El Salvador has comparative advantage in clothes.
Okay. All right. So if these two countries decide to trade, we think that El Salvador should actually produce the clothes, and we think that Colombia should actually produce the coffee. Pick a product. Clothes or coffee?
Clothes.
Okay. So we don't have a lot of room here. I'm going to try and write this right here. If we're producing clothes, which country makes it?
El Salvador.
All right.
Or
Oh.
should make it.
Yep. El Salvador offers $1 billion worth of clothes. What should the price be? What should Colombia give back in coffee? So we should look at, for both countries, well, $1 billion worth of clothes is equal to how much coffee?
1.3 tons of coffee for El Salvador.
So they want at least that much, right? And
What
$1
is
billion worth of clothes is worth how much to Colombia?
1.5?
Okay. So do they want to give more or less than 1.5?
Less.
Colombia wants to give less than 1.5. El Salvador wants more than 1.3. So it should be
Like 1.4.
it should be more than 1.3 and less than 1.5. So any number in that range, and you just said 1.4, that would be good. So if these two countries decide to specialize in where they have the comparative advantage, El Salvador in clothes, Colombia in coffee, and we chose to focus on El Salvador, you could do it the other way around. If El Salvador produces $1 billion worth of clothes, Colombia should trade, and El Salvador and Colombia would both be happy if they got between 1.3 and 1.5, so 1.4 works. Tons of coffee in return. So this is what's called the terms of trade. You have to use comparative advantage and the cost, the opportunity cost, to decide how much it's worth. Okay, so to quickly review, we've got three things. Absolute advantage, which country is just straight up better at producing what product. So again, El Salvador, 20 and 15 compared to Colombia, 30 and 20. Colombia has absolute advantage in both. Comparative advantage is opportunity cost. Colombia gives up less when they make coffee, and El Salvador gives up less when they make clothes.
And what's the equation again?
It is the cost of producing one product is equal to what you give up, the other, divided by what you actually produce. So other over is the way to remember it. And once you've determined who has the lower comparative advantage, that's the product they should make. And then you set up the equation to determine the terms of trade between their two costs. I'm going to stop the video right there. You've got a couple exercises that you can work with Maddie and your classmates on answering. Turn these in for credit. You can work by yourself. You can work with the teacher. You can work with your peers. If you have any questions, ask Maddie. If you have any questions you want me to continue to teach you on the small chalkboard, let me know. But we're going to end the production right there. Have a good class.